To make the case for Canadian film, it's important to know what's what. Canadian filmmakers work in a system that is specifically designed to help them succeed. So how do filmmakers fund their films? Canada's feature film funding system builds its movies on a three-legged stool model. The first leg is direct funding from the government, such as telefilm or provincial production funds. The second leg is labour tax credits that reduce the cost of employing cast and crew. The third is the market, distributors and broadcasters who pay license fees for Canadian or international rights. More than 100 feature films get made each year, but how do these films get to audiences? That brings us to distribution. Canadian distributors buy the media rights from Canadian producers before the film is made, which helps complete the finance plan and gives other investors, like Telefilm, confidence that the movie will be marketed and made available to cinemas, streaming platforms, broadcasters, schools, and airplanes in a professional way. Unlike in broadcasting, where broadcasters are required to make about 1/3 of their content homegrown, there are no quotas for Canadian content in cinema, and most movies that are seen here are from Hollywood. Only about 10% are independent, of which 5% are international independent cinema, and the other 5% are from Quebec and the rest of Canada. Canada's independent movie distributors are the ones that bring that 10% of non-Hollywood films to the Canadian market. This is the system that has existed since before the use of the internet and is governed by the Broadcast Act. The Broadcast Act was last updated in 1991. While the world changed around us, Canadian cultural policy stayed focused on broadcasters until now. Bill C-10 is a proposal to modernize the Broadcast Act. It will define the powers given to the CRTC, who manage the nitty-gritty of license terms for broadcasters, like CTV, CBC, Global, and Rogers, and how to license the streamers such as Amazon Video, Netflix, Crave, and Hulu to level the playing field. Also, for the first time, the Act proposes to require programming that reflects the viewpoints of Indigenous people and all of Canada's many and diverse communities. Online streaming has disrupted the distribution landscape for film, blurring the lines between broadcast and theatrical distribution, creating a unique niche in between the two. As this legislation is developed, we believe it's important to consider feature-length film in the mix. So what should the future look like for cinema? And how can we make sure that the new rules benefit a more inclusive, competitive industry?
Hello, my name is Ali Kazmi. I'm a filmmaker and I also teach film production in the Department of Cinema and Media Arts at York University. On behalf of the Academy of Canadian Cinema and Television, I welcome you to the first of 3 panels looking at Canadian feature fiction and distribution. Today, we 4 distinguished panelists are going to reflect on and offer solutions to the CRTC, Canadian broadcasters, and streaming systems in the context of Bill C-10. Cameron Bay is the co-head and director of International Film Festival. Since 1990, Cameron has been central to the growth of this iconic cultural organization. He actually began his career as a film critic and has published nationally and internationally. I would argue that Cameron has one of the most astute and accurate perspectives on the impact of Canadian film here and abroad. Jeff Chan is best known as the producer and director of the short film and subsequent feature Code 8. The feature was made possible by a record-breaking $3 million that was raised solely through crowdfunding. In fact, Jeff informed me that the exact figure raised was $3,036,283. Code 8 then went on to set records for video on demand and theatrical. As a massive success story, it's inspired many young filmmakers in Canada and elsewhere. Deepa Mehta needs little introduction. Deepa is an Oscar-nominated filmmaker whose award-winning films have played in every film festival and have been sold and distributed around the globe. Her films include the Elemental trilogy, Fire, Earth, and Water, Bollywood Hollywood, Heaven on Earth, and the epic adaptation of Salman Rushdie's novel, Midnight's Children. and most recently, an adaptation of Canada's own Shyam Selvadurais book, Funny Boy, which is nominated for Best Picture in this year's Screen Awards. Monique Simard is an award-winning producer and all-round cultural powerhouse. When she was an executive producer of the NFB's French program, she founded the country's first interactive studio. Monique led SODEC for 4 years and has served on the board of every prominent cultural organization in Quebec. We're especially happy to have her here today, as she was the member of the Federal Broadcast and Telecommunications Legislative Review Panel that produced the Yale Report. This report was the first in nearly 30 years to comprehensively examine Canada's communication system. Welcome to you all. I'm going to start with a couple of rounds of specific questions to each one of you that tap into your unique experiences. And then I'll ask some general questions that the panel as a whole can answer. So Cameron, I'd like to start with you. As a critic, writer, programmer, and now artistic head of TIFF, you are among a small group of people who have watched a significant number of Canadian films, feature films made over more than 3 decades. What kind of opportunities do you feel that Bill C-10 offers for Canadian filmmakers?
Thanks for having me, Ali, on this panel. It's a great group. I look forward to getting into it with everyone. Look, I think we're in a unique position in the world in Canada, being right next door to, and in many ways commercially dominated by the most dominant film industry and television industry in the world in the U.S. As a result, we need ways of being able to express ourselves as screen storytellers. Our artists need that. Our budget's never going to be the same. And the ability to get our films out into the marketplace and in front of audiences is never going to be the same as what exists in the US industry, simply because of the economic scale. So what C-10 does is extend some of the protection that already exists and some of the support that already exists in other areas into the new 21st century landscape. And I think that's an important thing to do. I think it's important to make sure that our storytellers are getting our movies out to audiences. And it's important because as much as we may have a lot of similarities, there's such important differences between the movies that we make and the movies that the US makes. We have, our films are in some ways comparable to American independent cinema, but that doesn't include, for instance, the films that are coming out of French-speaking Canada, most specifically in Quebec, but elsewhere as well. And those are important. Those need to be protected. Space needs to be kept open for those. Right now, I think the most important movement in Canadian cinema is Indigenous narrative sovereignty. And those stories are unique and distinct from what's going on in the US as well. And there needs to be space protected for that. So, anything that can keep that space open and get those films in front of Canadian audiences and then get them out to the world as well, I think is important. And without the kind of protection that something like Bill C-10 proposes, we can't keep that space open, because the power of the economics of the film industry and the dominance of Hollywood is just too great.
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning Quebec cinema. It offers me a perfect segue to Monique. Monique, Quebec has, of course, its own unique film production, distribution ecosystem. And like Cameron, your engagement with the system is multifaceted. You've been an actor, producer, director of both feature films and documentaries. Now, in addition to your high-level institutional perspective from the NFB and and SODEC, and then part of the being a member of the Yale Report, what do you say about the prospects for Quebec cinema? Have they improved or declined in the last 5 years?
Well, it's both in many ways. First of all, remind everybody that in Quebec you have SODEC, and that there's just as much money put into Quebec films by SODEC than by Téléfilm. So this is a unique situation in Canada, where the provincial provincial agency just is there with just much money. Also has had a very long tradition now of almost 30 years of supporting a kind of filmmaking, author filmmaking. Came out of that very well-known filmmakers that ironically now are in Hollywood, like Denis Villeneuve or Jean-Marc Vallée, for instance. They started with short films. That's a day. Well, so there's a strong base for Quebec cinema, you know, with talented more people. But then again, the whole system, like other national cinemas around the world, have been affected by what just Cameron talked about, the overwhelming Anglo platforms, dominant platforms that have drastically changed the business models that used to be traditionally support cinemas. And it's not only here in Canada, it's elsewhere in the world. So what Bill C-10 comes to correct, and by the way, Bill C-10 is widely supported in Quebec. There's not even a debate not for it to get it passed in Parliament. It will reshift money where it is needed. Where is it needed? It's needed to either support, invest in production, or in découvrabilité. I'm not going to say it in English. Découvrabilité, because we have, and of course, like again, an indigenous cinema, new stories, and you need resources. You need financial resources, and you need screens. And I say screens plural around the world, so for those stories to be told. So Quebec cinema is in the same situation as all other national cinemas at this point. Is that there needs to be money, and the money and what is not enough said is that where a lot of our cinema was based on being triggered by broadcasters. These broadcasters have less and less money because the publicity revenue has gone elsewhere. So the license they give are smaller and smaller, and that's what determines to trigger your financing from telefilm or the height of your budget. So that money that is going to dominant platforms has, in some way, to be redirected in Canada. And by the way, Canada, since the 30s, the mid 20th century, has claimed cultural sovereignty and has created institutions to regulate, manage that. The first one, CBC, Radio-Canada, and then B, and then that followed. I think it's really same that C10 along.
So we've talked about English Canada and Quebec, and then Deepa, I'm going to come to you next. You're the filmmakers who name your whole name across the country. Your first films, first three feature film, Me and Earth, went outside the system. Most recently acclaimed credit film Funny was in the system. So what is needed from this point on, so that what conditions do we need for the next generation of filmmakers following your footsteps?
Well, thanks, Ali, for on this. I mean, it gave me an opportunity actually in conversation with you, and even looking at and researching what Bill C-110 was all about. As filmmakers, we just take it for granted that our producers are going to do all that work as a director. I mean, I have been, and except when it affects me creatively. And so just reading about all of just listening to Cameron, listening to Monique, I think that yes, Bill C10 is extremely important. But I also think that in this process of trying to change the legislation, we must not forget something that's been vital to me in my experience and to younger filmmakers who I'm really happy that they are such a diverse bunch. And I'm just not even just talking about the Black and the Indigenous filmmakers, but I'm talking about all filmmakers. I mean, I think the young filmmakers, whether they're, Pakistani or Indian or Syrian or Afghani or white, I mean, we all feel a bit endangered right now and limited. And we get limited by something maybe that's extremely important for the legislation, which I hope it you know gets it in it. It is, what language do we make our films in? Can I choose to make water in Hindi? I just digress a bit, Ali, right now, because water was film that we actually got money from Telefilm for. Uh, for and but we had to make it in English. There was no way that to make a film that said about the widows in Varanasi, even though my producer's Canadian, I'm Canadian, most of the crew was Canadian, one of the leads was Canadian. The film would not be authentic if it was made in English. We wanted to make it in Hindi. But we couldn't get any money unless we made it in English. So we had to actually shoot the film in English and Hindi, which was expensive, time consuming, and a pain in the neck. Nobody had to go through that, but we really did want to make the film badly enough to actually go through this horrendous path. Because as Cameron knows, when the film was selected by TIFF to open the festival that year, it wasn't the English version, which is probably lying somewhere, I don't know where, if it still exists. It was the Hindi version. When it was for the Oscars by Canada, it could be nominated, for the Academy. It was the Hindi version. So why did we have to go through that? And we always have to. So I think that language is really, really important. The reason Fire, again, I remember Cameron, when you guys chose it to open as Perspective Canada those days. We were thrilled because we never got a cent from anybody. And except TIFF has always been the champion. So somehow, I think I'm such a fan of TIFF because suddenly it's colorblind. It's wonderful. It's about the film. It doesn't matter if it's in English or Hindi or it's the lead actor, whatever. It doesn't matter. It's about the film being authentic. And, have to do that. In this legislation, it hasn't ever happened. For 5 years, I have been going from the office of Minister Jolie, which was actually, I think it was an exercise in futility, and to Mr. Pablo Rodriguez, who was the Minister of Heritage, went to his office, talked about it, and saying it's really important while you're opening up things that you please take into consideration, because I'm working with mentoring or whatever, working with young filmmakers, one from Syria, one from Afghanistan right now, one from Korea, who really want to make their films in the language that they are comfortable. Their characters are set in whether it's in Seoul or whether it's in Baghdad or whether it's in Kabul. And they can't. So can you do something about it? And he said, we can't. Legislation changed. It's 5 years. I'm from not one officer. Years in opportunity. Please attention to. For me, it's really vital.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you're really point. And what was in for me looking at C10 was that it's got from clauses are strictly recognized. Of by indigenous films and their language. They all recognize first time the diversity of Indian makers from ethnic community as racial entities, and the overall equalities in the bill that once again reinforces all this. And indeed, one of the clauses also speaks to people with disabilities. So these clauses have not been a part of the Broadcast Act, which has spoken generally about diversity in front of the camera and behind it, but has never quite
Language.
defined it.
What about language? It doesn't mention language.
So it doesn't mention language. You're absolutely right. So I would like to put out this question to our audience that's watching us. There's a little poll that you can participate in. What do people feel about language? Can films made in languages other than English and French, should they be receiving funding from within the system and be recognized as Canadian productions? So I'm going to look forward to the results of this poll. So moving on to, and we'll come back to this, Deepa. I'm sure that the other panelists have much to say about this issue. Speaking about the next generation, we have with us Jeff, who has done amazing work working outside the system and taking a unique approach befitting his generation of using the potential and the power of the internet to create an audience and then deliver a film that has been widely received. It's been on many top 10 lists on Netflix. And so Jeff, I just want to ask you, you've spent time in LA. Your production company offers services for American productions who shoot in Canada. How do you feel about Bill C-10?
Well, thanks for having me, Ali. Really, excited to be here. And it's interesting, I can't really speak, at the same level of the other panelists. They've had decades more experience than me. And I think for me, I can only really speak about my own experiences being a filmmaker. I've always been a bit of an odd duck, kind of this, person who made short films in Toronto. Grew up in my film community here, my film family is here, but then I felt like the only way for me to go and have a career making kind of movies, which was for me more in the genre space, is to go down to LA and get involved in that system. And I did that for a few years, had a really bad time, and then decided that wasn't for me, and that if I was to continue having a career in this business, it had to be somewhat on my own terms, which is when I decided to do the short film, come back to Canada, and that ended up being an experience that really kind of gave us a bit of momentum to be able to look at making a feature on our own terms. At that time, I had the option to either go back to the studio system. We had interest and some solid offers on the table in terms of making the film with those partners, or kind of to at the time what felt like a bit of a risk to come and make this out of the Canadian system in Canada. And for us, it was really important to make the movie on our own terms, and by working with Telefilm, who really supported the film, we were able to go make the movie, and myself and my creative team were able to maintain final cut and production controls and creative controls. And that really is felt like unlike anything I've ever had experience in terms of the process of being a filmmaker, and it really opened up my eyes to the opportunities that actually Canada has to offer. Because I think from my perspective, and I think maybe filmmakers who are just a little less established, you're just looking for a path. You're like in terms of the policy of Bill C-10, that is almost abstract, I think, to your average filmmaker who's at a film school, and you just want to see, where can I have a future where I can pay my rent making movies? And I think what Bill C-10 will do is create that opportunity in Canada in a much bigger way. And for me and a lot of people around me, I think we're taking a long bet on Canada. I think Canada actually Bill C-10 will protect a lot of really important, aspects of the film community, but also I think it offers a ton of opportunity. I think Bill C-10, I think there's a possibility for Canadian content to really blow up globally. And for it to be a net economic gain for the country and a cultural gain for the country. So, I think it's inevitable regardless of the bill, but I think the bill will accelerate that in a massive way. And I think for a lot of, people like me who are just trying to get in and are looking at different ways to get in, Bill C-10 will further allow us to marry aspects that are outside the system, whether it's Indiegogo or whatever way you get your movie made, your TikTok followers, it doesn't really matter, but find a way to marry that with, Canadian institutional, funds and other supports that can help, find, create pathways for filmmakers to kind of make their content in a way that's newer and more accessible for people who are coming up. So I think it's a really important issue. Despite the fact that, I think for a lot of young filmmakers, it's, they know that it's important, but they don't know necessarily all the lines in policy.
So I'm curious, when you went to Telefilm with the money you'd raised, what was the initial reaction? Had they had someone like you come to them before with this kind of funding?
I mean, it was interesting when, I had a lot of misconceptions about the Canadian system. I think I've always been a little bit on the outside of that. So when I brought this into Telefilm, we weren't sure how they would react to it. I was told by a lot of people even before going to Telefilm that, you have to, you can't be the person. You as a individual filmmaker, find a Canadian producer to work with you. You need to, go through, some of the establishment. When I went to Telefilm, I went with Stefazam at the time, who was a supporter of this from the very beginning. And I said, listen, I have the opportunity to make this in the States with a studio, but I'd really love to just do this in Canada and partner with you and build it. And I kind of want to have control of it. I want to own the rights, and I want to have final cut and production controls. And she was like, okay, well, let's talk about how we could do that. And it was not an easy process, nor should it be. They were very responsible. I had to bring on elements that made it so that, I became a trustworthy element for, Telefilm, and it became real. But at no point were they like, hey, you need to find a bigger producer. That's the only way we'll do this with you. And I think one of the things that I'm really excited about, and I think we're already seeing this a little bit in the US, where you're seeing the power shift a little bit from, just pure producers to multi-hyphenates, right? And I think that's something that is happening here as well, hopefully. I think people who are writers and directors and actors can learn how to produce. And I think the future really lies in multi-hyphenates who can do multiple things and have a direct connection to an audience. That to me, I think is really exciting. So if anything, I just think there's a change happening both in the US, but also in Canada now, where, people with a connection to their audience or can do multiple things have an opportunity to find really interesting ways to make movies.
Great. Thank you. That's fascinating. Monique, you've heard from filmmakers, and you've heard from Cameron. You've been part of this federal review process. How do these views jive with what your discussions have been at the federal level?
Our mandate was gigantic. We had not only the Broadcast Act, we had telecommunications also. 18 months to review everything. So it was really, really hard work. But one thing we understood quite fast in the first few weeks, because of course we went across the country talking to everybody. That was very, very, very important. But we met with scientists at the beginning, with technical experts. And one thing which we kept in mind, they said, the change are so fast and you have to be nimble. You have to be nimble because one system will change rapidly. So if you do reform the legislation or the regulations, you have to keep it nimble so it will adapt to reality, because we are in a changing world. Things are moving so fast. Exaggerate, but every month you have a new technology. So how to keep your values, which are important, okay? Culture, creators, stories that have to be told, diversity, how to keep that into mind and build up a system that will constantly adapt to the new realities and still keeping the space for younger filmmakers, like you said, Jeff, others of the diversity, other languages. By the way, SODEC, we have 20% of our money that goes to autre langue, which includes English. So it can be Arabic or Spanish, etc. But we've had that in our programs for years now. That's SODEC. So and because we have to distinguish something. C10 is the result, it's partly the result of our report, but we have much more than that in our report. Also, C10 is the legislative framework that has to be changed and that we recommended strongly. After that comes another set of rules that will be established by, it won't be the CRTC anymore. We propose to change the name because it's still called, radio and television. Radio and television doesn't mean anything today. So I have to change the name of that. Let's say it will be the regulatory body that will have to make up rules and change the rules as reality changes. The Canadian Media Fund, which is an instrument, an organization that we gave ourselves in Canada 25 or 30 years ago, I don't remember, it's early 90s anyhow. When cable television appeared, we needed something to see how can we feed these cables that are television, and we don't want, dumping of American products. And we need to build a Canadian industry, independent production industry. So we created the Canadian Media Fund, which was called at that time Fonds des Câbleaux, or Cable Fund. It changed names. But it changed, the rules were changed regularly. Telefilm has to change. They've done a big consultation recently. They know they have to change because we're in between two worlds, a traditional kind of, system and a new system. So how are you going to adapt from one traditional to the new one? How many years will it take? I think it's going to go faster than most people think. So, for example, raising money on the internet with, whatever fun it can be. At first, the tax credit people said, well, for every dollar they raise, we'll subtract $1 from tax credit. I said, that's so stupid. You're just discouraging people of raising money. We should reward them for every dollar they raise. We'll give them 2 because, they're going out of the system to find ways to raise money. So I think that's the message. And of course, C10, it's legislative language. It's hard to read. And if you're not a lawyer, you're not used to those terms, it's really difficult. By the way, I was one of the 6 experts. I was the only non-lawyer of the gang. I think I earned my degree in law after those months together with them, which were great. But it's a bit harsh, to get into it. Even I realize the journalists don't get it completely if they don't have legal training or get the information. But essentially, it says it gives the power to the regulatory body to adapt and to also have jurisdictions over new players in the game, which was not the case and is still not the case, which I think was a huge mistake 20 years ago when the CRTC said, we won't touch the internet. That's not our thing. Not knowing, not seeing how internet would become dominant in our society. Now, I want to be clear on this because the big battle against C10 is that, they're going to regulate internet, freedom of speech is finished. That is not true. We wrote an open letter for the 6 members of the panel. 2 others could not because they're very active still in their law practice. The other ones were more independent. Peter Grant, that you probably know, which is one of the best communication lawyers, Pierre Trudel, and Janet Yale, of course, our chair, saying that is not true. When we say that there can be regulation on sharing platforms, it's for the part where, for example, on YouTube, there is professional music put on that. It's not to manage your cat videos or whatever people put on those sharing platforms. And there might have been a mistake how the way they introduced it, but essentially it's for that. It is industrial, commercial activities that divert audiences and divert revenues from other platforms. And the basis is if you're doing business in Canada on these platforms, you have to give back. Different ways to give back. If you're a curator, Netflix is a curator. You know, they decide what's on their platform. Then you have aggregators, other kinds of platforms where they aggregate different, you know, like Crave, for example. And then you have sharing platforms. Sharing platforms, it's difficult to understand because we had weeks of discussions on that because there are different kind of content put on that. But there is professional content, not only personal content. So the commercial part of it should go, the CRTC or the regulatory body should be able to intervene on that part. And of course, most of all, it's all the heinous content, you know, and then criminal laws should get, you know, applied on what they call social harm content on these platforms, that also. But essentially it's that. And I've tried, and there is no threat to freedom of expression. And
right. I think that's being used a lot. In fact, today there was again this particularly by the Conservatives and the opponents of Bill C-10. It seems to me that the idea of freedom of expression has become an increasingly distracting issue from the real issues at hand. And I think I'd like to bring it back to within the context of feature films. One of the things that you said, and thank you for giving that amazing overview. And it's also wonderful to hear you say, which I haven't heard anywhere, that the name of the CRTC would change to truly represent what the regulations would be a new name.
We suggested that it should be called the Canadian Communications Commission. Et ça va bien en français, la Commission Canadienne des Communications.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that's a wonderful name. And the other exciting thing that I heard from you is that SODEC has already set a precedent, and in fact has a long-standing precedent for funding films.
Autre langage, other languages.
Other languages.
Other languages.
So Deepa, how do you feel when you hear that? Isn't that an adequate precedent to be included in the legislation?
I think it's overwhelming, and I wish I lived in Montreal. You know, really.
Oh, you're invited to move.
But I mean, Monica, it's amazing. But I really wish it would, for us now, is an opportunity for being more than 20%. You know, it really should be 20%.
Well,
perhaps
that was a rule
30 years ago felt appropriate, but you know, it isn't that. It just gives a freedom. I mean, how can we talk about inclusion and diversity and not talk about one of the main proponents of that? I mean, how do you make us feel inclusive if we can't speak in the language or do something in a language or make a film in a language that we want to make it in? I mean, we you know, it's fine, we'll do everything else, but give us that creative freedom, because it is about creativity.
Well, I think that your comments and your remarks should go to Téléfilm Canada, which is the main federal funding agency.
No, it has to. I have been talking about 5 years. I've been talking about it, but it has to be a change of legislation. That's what I finally found out from Mr. Rodriguez, and the research that we've done, it has to be in the legislation. And then Telefilm is actually very happy to compile that. They are. They never have ever said we won't do it. They always have said to me, our hands are tied. So
well, it's interesting that.
Well, C10 opens it, all these things.
Exactly. That's why, you know, I'm all for C10. You know, for many that Jeff spoke about of it. You know, absolutely. I feel that it is an opportunity for us, without sounding condescending in any way, to grow up, to actually embrace what we talk about. Let's not keep on talking about cultural and diversity and inclusion when you're not actually giving us an opportunity to be included.
I think that very sincerely, and I will stop at this, that all the arguments against C10 about freedom of expression is just a pretext
I know.
to not get it be adopted because of all the other so important things in C10. And
so we'll keep pushing forward.
Yeah.
For C10. And so Cameron, Deepa has identified TIFF as a huge supporter, and clearly TIFF has not been confined by CanCon rules as defined by Telefilm or other agencies, and in a way has allowed, as Deepa has, using Deepa's example, to expand this idea of Canadianness. Do you think that Bill C10 goes far enough in doing that?
Look, I don't think we can rely on any piece of legislation to completely define what the artistry of film is going to be. I think the best we can do is look to our laws to create as equitable a playing field as possible, and that's not the same as equal, but equitable, addressing previous inequities, for instance, and to give storytellers as much freedom as possible. I love the fact that filmmakers like Denis Villeneuve and Jean-Marc Vallée and Deepa and others have international careers and can make films all over the world should they choose to. But I think it's important that they can also make those films in Canada, that there should be enough of an infrastructure, enough support to make those films made. And part of that support, and now, this is something that's very important to us at TIFF, part of that support is for the independent theatrical exhibition of films. And it's critically important that independent cinemas are part of that landscape that supports independent artists. We're often the first to really get behind Canadian films because these are often films made on smaller budgets by filmmakers who are, emerging into their feature film careers. They don't have big commercial marketing budgets behind them. Who else is going to support them besides the independent cinemas from coast to coast to coast? So, that I think needs to also be supported. We've seen, for instance, the Bytown Cinema in Ottawa going under during the pandemic. It can't continue operating because it was operating in a kind of very fragile environment to begin with. And you're closed for a year, and suddenly that fragile environment becomes a kind of a lethal environment. So supporting, legislation that supports the artists, that supports the Canadian distribution landscape, and the Canadian independent exhibitors, I think is critically important.
So picking up on that, I know that the TIFF Lightbox has also been affected. It's very much part of that ecosystem of theatrical release, and has played an important role for many Canadian films being screened on the large screen. How do you see streaming services? How do you see them fitting into theatrical release? Because they are it's an integral part of the system now. They have their role has been quite disruptive and offers new potential and also challenges.
Yeah, I mean, my take on this is that it's not a war. These aren't opposing sides between the streaming services and the theatrical industry. We should all be here to support the storytelling, the artists, the continuity of all of that work. And we all depend on what comes out of the screens and the pens of the people who are telling these stories to begin with. So at TIFF we've been able to work with streaming companies, whether that's Crave here in Canada or Netflix or Amazon or Apple at the festival and year round, in a kind of a united support of the storytelling. That for us is what it's all about. Obviously streamers aren't going away, and it's a great way for a lot of people who don't have access to an independent cinema or to an art house cinema in their own neighborhood across the country to be able to see films. You can see Loretta Todd's Monkey Beach, a beautiful Canadian film on Crave right now, and it's not available theatrically, not just because theaters are closed in most of the country, but because, it's not the sort of film that would get a wide release across Canada. So, we need that access, I think, for Canadian filmmakers, but it can't just be that. There has to be a thriving theatrical landscape as well. And often we've been really disappointed sometimes with the Canadian films that do very well at our film festival, go on to win awards, that sort of thing. They struggle to get into theatrical release afterwards because they just don't have the promotional dollars behind them.
Yeah, so
I think that the streaming services, like you say, are there to, and the pandemic, because we're still in a pandemic, has been an accelerator of phenomena. And it's also like in loop, on everything. So it's an accelerator of phenomena that started before, and of course that's amplified. There has to be a space, and I think it's a complementary space that is occupied. And now the streamers could be and should be considered like triggering production, admissible to trigger production, because the system works. You need a distributor, like you said, Jeff, complicated. Well, now with the new legislation, they could be considered a triggering financing from other institutions, and they are sure of certain audiences. It's different kind of audiences elsewhere. So there has to be a space and for every kind of film. So we have to be agnostic, stream-wise and technology-wise. One thing is good for one, might be not good for the other, but there has to be, and not have a rigid system like we had before. La chronologie des médias. First you have your film, then you go to a festival, and then you can go to theatrical release, sometimes not finding a theater, as Cameron says. And then you'll go on television so many months after, you sell CDs or DVDs, and then eventually on television. That is a world that is finished. That is
the world that's entered now.
That is
the world that's entered now. I mean, part of the ecosystem is also giving back to the system, right? I mean, I think one of the key things that Bill C-10 is asking is that it recognizes this new the changed landscape, and it basically says now it's time for these streaming services to start giving back to the system, back to Canadian production. I mean, when you look at other jurisdictions like France and Germany, for example, they have seized control. I mean, they have said that a certain percentage of the revenues earned will go to fund their national cinema. So, Jeff, how do you see that change, and what kind of further suggestions do you have in terms of what Bill C-10 can do in dealing with the streaming services?
I mean, I agree with everything Cameron said. I think it would be a tragedy for us to lose our independent cinemas and cinema in general. This is why, at least for me, why I got into the business and why I got into making movies, is to see movies on the big screen. The reality at the same time for me is, it takes 2 seconds to pull up a union production report and look through the 20-page list right now and see how many of those are being funded and financed by streaming services and how many are run by Canadians. The answer is very few. So I think for me, the reality in terms of the net benefit to Canadian filmmakers is really legislation on the streaming side of things, because that's where, if we're just being real, the money is being spent. That's where the eyeballs are. And I think for our movie, Codatum, it's a little movie. We finished, we put it out there. We did very well on VOD. But really, it was a streaming service that put us on the map. Netflix got a great deal on our movie because we put it on their platform, and they were like, we have no idea what's going to happen, and it just happened to blow up. And I think we live in this world where I think there's 2 things we need to do. We need to protect cinema as we know it and the traditions that we know. That's very important. But we also have to look at building an economic reality for new creators, be it the writers, actors, directors, whatever it is, to look at Canada and say, hey, this is a place where I can settle down, I can have a family and have meaningful work. And that's not making one indie movie every 10 years, right? That's like actually being involved in a system where the system will look at what you have to offer and contribute and say, here's a financial incentive for you to stay here and create content out of Canada where your voice matters. Or is the answer you have to go down to LA and get into that, stuff, So that to me is kind of how I look at it. I think it's all important, every aspect of this. But if Bill C-10 changes that, the biggest aspect, which is I think is how streamers are regulated in Canada, I think from a net effect, that probably is the biggest thing that it can do.
And have you been hoping for something like this to come along?
I mean, in a weird way, I've bet the last 5 to 10 years on it. Really, I realized that making films in LA in that system wasn't for me. So I've been waiting for this for my entire career, and I hope it happens because I think there is a massive cultural, artistic, and economic opportunity for filmmakers to stay here in Canada and make content, films, television, whatever it is that puts Canadians on the map, right? And our relation to all that stuff is changing. Like it's behavioral, right? Like you can't say that the last few years hasn't changed the way people look and their behavioral tendencies towards interacting with filmmaking and stories. So I think Monique's saying that this is a thing that provides the ability for a system to adapt and to change. That's really the win. I don't think we can know exactly what those changes need to be because we're in the middle of a massive turnover right now. So it gives me a lot of hope that Bill C-10 is on the table, and it makes me think that there could be a very bright future.
Can I just add
yes,
one
Cameron,
thing?
go ahead.
Thank you. Jeff, I agree with everything you were saying. And Ali, you had mentioned France and Germany in terms of countries that, through legislation, through levies, they're able to support their local industry. I don't know if you guys noticed when Ye Jong-yoon accepted her Oscar for Minari, how Hollywood and the Oscars and all of that seem just like tangential. She has a full career. She's happy to get recognition in LA and from the US industry, but she's confident in her own career at home. Same the year before with Bong Joon-ho and Parasite. The South Korean film industry for me is the model. And for decades, they have actually been using a portion of their box office revenue, other revenues that come in to support South Korean filmmakers in a way that really, I think very few other countries have been able to do to really kind of have a very strong local domestic industry. They're not that much bigger than us. Their population's around 50 million, we're around 36 million, but they have so much stronger a local film industry. And what can we learn from them?
No, but it's also true, Cameron. And Jeff, even if I may say so, look at the Indian film industry. Look at it. It is so healthy. When you look at Netflix or you look at the movies, movie halls are open. People are dying in India, but the movie halls are still open. Now they've closed, thank God. But all the streaming services were hand in hand with the movie halls. I went to Z5, which is one of the biggest local streaming services, extremely, in fact, much stronger than Netflix or Prime in India right now. They recognize cinema, they promote it. They loved Funny Boy, for example. But they said, we can't stream it till you dub it in Hindi. I thought that, okay. And I really applaud that. So, yes, Canada is very healthy. It's great. And we can talk about it's a place to be. But somehow how do we make it a place for all of us, Jeff? For me, there's an exclusion. I feel that. You're English speaking, and you can talk about it's cool, and I applaud you, and I applaud your generation. But I'm saying, what about the younger people who are not like you, who still have a pull with the country of their origin? They might have chosen Canada, they might love Canada, they probably do. but they want to create in a language that they heard their grandmother speak to them.
Well, I mean, I don't disagree with you at all in terms of being able to make films in any language, in Canada. I think language, we're talking about Parasite, a foreign language film can win Best Picture. So clearly it doesn't matter what language a movie is in anymore, right? And I actually think streaming is part of that change because now we're talking about global audiences. Even if you look at the mandate within Netflix, and the way they restructure the business, it's much more globally driven. You're seeing multi-language production. So I absolutely agree with you. I think anything that limits, I think the Canadian film industry or Bill C-10 or whatever it may be should ultimately go to supporting Canadian filmmakers, however they want to make their movies, right? So there's no disagreement about that at all. I'm only speaking from a perspective of just someone who's looking at the business from the outside trying to get in at all.
I think we have 5 minutes left. Cameron, I do want to thank you for bringing in South Korea and Deepa for bringing in India. I think we often get stuck in our references, but they're usually very Eurocentric in terms of how things are looked at, even at the policy level. And I think it's really important for us to broaden our horizons. And certainly in the next panel that's part of this series, we will be doing that. We have just under 5 minutes left. I'd love to get some wrap-up thoughts from each one of you. And Deepa, perhaps you can start. And just, I know you've made a very passionate plea for the inclusion of language, but you've also mentioned that you're mentoring some young filmmakers. What kind of a landscape do you hope that they start to enter, apart from the language issue, which we've discussed?
I think of Agam, for example. Agam Darshi, amazing. She's doing her first feature right now in Saskatchewan, and it's about the Sikh family, and I think that it's so important for her that she's feeling actually comfortable that there is an environment that actually embraces what it's like for a third generation Sikh person. So I would like, whether I want to make a film or another younger person wants to make a film, forget about me, wants to make a film about that has nothing to do with their racial memory or their cultural memory or the color of their skin, absolutely they should. And I think that it's so important for young filmmakers that they don't feel if they're white that they don't have a place in this country anymore. Hurt people. We cannot do the same for what's been done to us. I think that's very important.
Cameron, would you like to do a follow-up to that?
Yeah, look, I think whatever happens with Bill C-10 is going to be most helpful for that next generation of filmmakers who are early in their careers. They might have made 1 or 2 features or some shorts, and I think that's the landscape we want to prepare for. I think of Stella Meggy, a Black Canadian filmmaker, grew up in Oshawa, dreaming of being a film director, went to the States, and that's where she's making all of her movies. She's making studio movies in the US. Why could she not have stayed? Because there wasn't an environment here. I feel like people like her, whether it's Kelly Fife Marshall, who's made an award-winning short, or people like Tracy Deer, who made a wonderful feature, Beans, Dennis Goulet, who I am sure will be attracting the attention of the studios and the big streamers after making her feature Night Raiders. Those are the people that there needs to be a strong domestic industry in Canada to support so they can make the choice. It doesn't have to be this magnet that's drawing them down to LA. If they choose to live and work here and continue to develop their career here, they can do that. And there's enough support for them, and their films can be seen by Canadians. And that's going to take some work, and sometimes that work starts on Parliament Hill.
Exactly. We tried to get Stella for this panel actually, and she is remarkably busy, and she couldn't join us. Monique, just a quick wrap up. We have a couple of minutes left.
Okay.
I just want to get some.
Just wanted to say
thoughts from
something,
you.
just to remind people that when French-speaking filmmakers want to have us make films and get more money, they're always asked to do an English film before doing it in French. And that has been the dominant model. And for the Denis Villeneuve and of this world that have huge success, they had to switch to English to have success. So the dominance of English, the ones that have the most experience of that are certainly Francophone filmmakers in Canada. Just wanted to remind that. And the vibrancy of Quebec cinema is because you fight back all the time. Come back to the essential. We cannot do anything we would wish for cinemas, for theaters, for young filmmakers, for other types of initiative if we don't get C10 through, because that where we'll rely the sources, the financial, the possibility of having financial resources. There's never been so much money circulating in the audiovisual world, never. And the chunk of money that each Canadian pays to buy devices, to subscribe to platforms, well, some of that money has to be redirected to creation, production, and découvrabilité. It's essential.
Excellent. Now, I think that couldn't be a better spot for us to wrap up. I want to thank all of you for your invaluable contributions to this ongoing discussion. And I hope the people who are going to be affected and who have the power to affect the legislation watch this. And I think we will, in fact, I know we are going to continue this discussion online as part of a Reddit subgroup. So I encourage the viewers to carry on the discussion on that platform. With that, I'd like to thank Beth Johnson of the Academy for organizing these panels and for giving us all the opportunity to speak to Bill C10. Thank you.